There is a rhythm in history, a dark choreography of unrest and upheaval that has repeatedly dismantled empires and republics alike. In the past 250 years, three monumental governments, France in 1789, Russia in 1917, and Cuba in 1959, collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, their own blind spots. Each revolution tore through society with a ferocity that stunned the rulers, toppling regimes that once seemed invincible. And now, as we stand in 2025, the United States finds itself tracing this very same pattern, step for step, grievance for grievance, as if the script had been written long ago in the blood and chaos of past upheavals. Let us cast our gaze back to 1789 France. At that moment in time, France was not a backwater nation, but the crown jewel of Europe, rich, cultured, intellectually vibrant. Paris was the beating heart of Enlightenment thought. French was the language diplomats spoke from London to Constantinople. King Louis XVI reigned over a monarchy whose legacy stretched back 8 centuries, an empire seemingly eternal. Yet beneath the gilded veneer, France was rotting from within. The first stage in the revolution's grim sequence was glaring: extreme wealth inequality. France's population of 27 million was divided into 3 estates, a rigid social pyramid. The first estate, the clergy, owned 10% of the land and yet paid no taxes, shielded by divine privilege. The second estate, the nobility, only 400,000 strong, a mere 1.5% of population, held a quarter of the land, also largely exempted from taxation. And then the third estate, a sprawling 26 million souls, peasants, laborers, city workers, and merchants who owned 65% of the land, yet bore the entire tax burden. Imagine that, a tiny minority living in palaces and hunting lodges, feasting on elaborate banquets, while the vast majority struggled to sustain themselves on insufficient bread. By 1788, France's farmland had suffered a poor harvest, sending bread prices soaring, a catastrophic blow when bread equaled 88% of a peasant's food budget. And still, the nobility lived as if untouched by famine. This wasn't merely economic disparity. It was a profound fracture in the collective consciousness of a nation. The elites were not just rich. They were detached from reality, indifferent to suffering, protected by centuries of privilege. The second phase was government corruption and paralysis. Louis XVI was no tyrant in the strictest sense, but a monarch crippled by indecision and ignorance. France's treasury was empty, drained by endless wars, including the costly gamble of supporting an insurgent America. But instead of confronting systemic reform, Louis resorted to deeper debt and increased taxation on the already crushed peasants. The nobility resisted any proposal to lighten their own load, scrambling to block reforms that threatened their privileges. The clergy aligned with them, spending with impunity. The state was bankrupt not only financially, but morally. This lodged a critical fissure in legitimacy. The government was seen as fundamentally unjust and incompetent. By 1789, the crisis erupted. The government could no longer pay its bills. The people could no longer feed themselves. In a desperate move, Louis XVI convened the Estates General, a general assembly that had not met for 175 years. His intent was to wring consent for new taxes, but the result was far more explosive. This moment marks the emergence of the third stage, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class. The third estate included not only peasants, but also lawyers, merchants, and intellectuals. The emerging bourgeoisie, people who had long invested in the idea of stability and gradual progress. Yet their voices were drowned in a system where each estate had but one vote, allowing the privileged groups to outvote them 2-1. Frustrated and galvanized by injustice, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, vowing to draft a constitution. Locked out of their usual chambers, they assembled in a tennis court, pledging not to disband until the country was reformed. This was the profound moment when the allies of order turned revolutionaries. What followed was swift and unprecedented. On July 14, 1789, the Bastille prison, long a symbol of royal oppression, was stormed by Parisians. The guards were killed, their heads paraded on pikes through the streets. The monarchy's reign was no longer assured. The revolution was underway. This marks the onset of Stage 4, the loss of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the Catholic Church, the judiciary, all pillars of the old regime, were delegitimized almost overnight. The National Assembly abolished feudal obligations, seized church lands, and proclaimed the rights of man. Yet these measures failed to satiate the revolution's restless thirst. More radical factions emerged, led by the Jacobins and the merciless Robespierre, demanding the king's execution, redistributions of wealth, and purges of perceived enemies. The economy remained in chaos, food still scarce, fear and anger mounting. Stage 5 now swept in, the revolutionary movement capturing the masses. January 21, 1793, was the date that sealed France's descent into the abyss. King Louis XVI was guillotined publicly. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, followed soon after. The revolution that began with promises of liberty and equality spiraled into the Reign of Terror, where in a span of about a year, 40,000 people, nobles, priests, and even moderate revolutionaries, were executed. This final climax was Stage 6, overthrow and chaos. The grim purges extended beyond enemies. Revolution devours its own children, and Robespierre himself was not spared, executed by the very machine of terror he had created. Exhausted and broken by a decade of bloodshed and war engulfing Europe, France finally succumbed to a new dictatorship under Napoleon Bonaparte, an irony that underscores the recurring tragedy of revolutions. The liberation they promise so often ends in despotism. The French saga reveals a brutal truth: extreme inequality, government failure, fractured middle class, loss of institutional faith, mass radicalization, and ensuing chaos. This six-stage pattern is not merely historical trivia. It is a dark template encoded into the anatomy of revolution, replaying itself across centuries and continents. And 1789 France is only the beginning of this unsettling narrative. The echoes of France's upheaval did not fade quietly into history. Rather, they echoed across the European continent and beyond, reverberating into the icy heart of Russia nearly a century and a quarter later. The sequence, oddly familiar in its rhythm, unfolded again with terrifying conviction through the streets of Petrograd in 1917. Here, a vast empire, one of the greatest powers of its time, shattered under the weight of the same six-stage cycle. Russia of the early 20th century was an empire of stark contradictions. Its crown jewel, Tsar Nicholas II, ruled over a population hungry not only for bread but for dignity, justice, and hope. Yet like Louis XVI, Nicholas was a man out of time, isolated, indecisive, and grasping desperately at fading imperial authority. The fractures beneath Russia's surface were perhaps even more grotesque than those of pre-revolutionary France. Extreme wealth inequality was once again the opening act. The landed aristocracy and industrial magnates lived lives of plenitude, fortified by legal immunities that mirrored France's privileges of birthright. Meanwhile, the peasants and industrial workers, the vast majority, endured grinding poverty. Factories belched smoke but paid meager wages. The countryside, riddled with famine and exploitation, saw families barely survive winters that grew harsher with every passing year. Russia, too, was mired in government paralysis and corruption. The Tsarist bureaucracy was a bureaucracy in name only. The actual gears of governance creaked and stalled under the weight of nepotism, incompetence, and a hollow currency depleted by endless warfare. World War I, like France's American Revolution gamble, was a fatal miscalculation. Millions of Russian soldiers died on the front lines, many starving or freezing in impossibly harsh conditions, while the nobility and aristocracy remained ensconced in their palaces, distant and insulated from the human cost. The middle class similarly fractured and radicalized. Unlike France, Russia's middle class was smaller but growing, populated by professionals, army officers, and the intelligentsia, the self-styled champions of reform and justice. But they too found themselves locked out of power. The Duma, the Russian parliament, lacked real authority, dismissed time and again by the Tsar. Disillusionment became despair. the middle class no longer sought cautious reform. It began coveting revolution. The February Revolution of 1917 would mark the decisive collapse of faith in institutions. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty ended after 3 centuries. The provisional government that followed failed spectacularly to restore order or feed the masses. The church, the monarchy, even the vast bureaucratic apparatus, all lay in ruins of public trust. This vacuum of authority beckoned deeper revolutionary fervor. The Bolsheviks, a radical faction led by Vladimir Lenin, seized upon this stage 5 moment, mobilizing workers, soldiers, and peasants with promises of peace, land, and bread. The mass movement engulfed Russia, sweeping away moderates and conservatives alike in its wake. Violence intensified, ideological purges swept the countryside and the cities. Then came the final stage, the chaos. The October Revolution unleashed a civil war that would kill millions, destroy countless communities, and rend the fabric of Russia into ideological and physical wreckage. The Red Terror rivaled Robespierre's guillotine, consuming friend and foe alike. Once more, revolution devoured its own children, old comrades becoming enemies overnight, the idealistic dissolved by ruthless realpolitik. After these catastrophic years, Russia was transformed, no longer the empire it was, but a sprawling Soviet Union forged from brutality and fear. Lenin's dictatorship brought its own contradictions. A regime born to liberate but shackled to oppression and state terror. The cycle had ended, yet its wounds would scar the world for generations. What emerges from this dark mirror is a haunting realization. These revolutions are not mere collapses of governments. They are seismic ruptures in the human spirit, fractures where faith in justice, fairness, and order crumbles. The 6 stages mark not just political failure, but a collective loss of possibility. As history churned onward, Cuba in 1959 would become the next tableau of this relentless dance, where young revolutionaries overthrew an aging dictatorship, only to find themselves ensnared in the same spiral of hope, radicalization, and eventual entrapment. The script was written, but the actors changed, each revolution a new performance in an age-old tragedy. And now, as shadows lengthen over the United States, the question becomes not if, but when this Stage 4 loss of faith in institutions will give way to Stage 5's mass mobilization, and what chaos might follow. For in this choreography of collapse, 2025 is not an anomaly but a continuation. History whispers a chilling truth: revolutions are never spontaneous. They are inevitable, predictable, and yet never fully understood until the moment comes crashing down. But the story was far from over. Fast forward to 1917, Russia, a land of vast contrasts and chained ambitions, where a similar tragedy was unfolding under the shadow of the Romanov dynasty. The Tsarist regime, like the Bourbon monarchy, was a relic weighed down by fashioning the past into law and power. Russia was a country of immense resources and potential, yet a critical mass of its 170 million people lived in abject poverty. The 19th century had failed to modernize Russia's economy and society fast enough. Industrialization lagged behind Western Europe. Its peasants remained serfs in all but name. And the rigid aristocracy clung to privileges reminiscent of those in old France. Here again, the first breach was wealth and class disparity. The land was held by an elite few, while the peasantry lived as serfs, barely surviving through backbreaking toil. A nascent industrial working class had grown, concentrated in factories that swallowed bodies and spit out misery. Strikingly, Russia's military defeats in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 and the catastrophic losses in World War I drained national morale and state coffers alike, exposing the government's incompetence and greed, the second stage of corruption and paralysis. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, could neither satisfy reformists nor repress revolutionaries. His regime crafted edicts but delivered little. Promises rang hollow as famine loomed, inflation surged, and dissent simmered. The urban middle classes and intelligentsia found themselves cornered, their dreams of constitutionalism and progress crushed by autocracy's iron grip. Radical ideas began to flood the streets. Socialism, communism, anarchism, each promising to shatter the old order. The middle class, a rising but fragile force, fractured under intense pressure. Some sought reform, some endorsed revolution. The Duma, Russia's parliament, was an impotent patchwork of nobles and liberals. It could not govern or represent the people's urgent needs. This systemic dysfunction birthed mass protests, strikes, and soldiers' mutinies. By February 1917, the Tsarist state was unraveling. This accelerated into the crucial fourth stage, the collapse of institutional faith. The Orthodox Church, the monarchy, the military hierarchy, they all lost their aura of invincibility and legitimacy. As order deteriorated, radical elements seized the narrative. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, staged a coup to wrest power violently. Their promise was stark: land, peace, and bread. The masses, exhausted by war and starvation, embraced this vision. But promises begot terror. The ensuing civil war plunged Russia into chaos. The Red Terror executed thousands, crushing noble, clergy, and moderate opponents alike. The revolution cannibalized itself as factions warred for supremacy. Stage 5's mass radicalization swelling into Stage 6's disintegration. The Romanovs were executed, a chilling symbol that no bastion was safe. Out of this storm, the Soviet Union emerged. A new regime wrapped in revolutionary rhetoric, but one that would evolve into a dictatorship as inexorable and restrictive as the one it had replaced. History's haunting refrain continued: not just revolution, but revolution turned tyranny. What lies beneath this echo across France and Russia? It is not merely a sequence of lost kings and fallen empires, but a meditation on the fragility of systems built on inequality and exclusion. Economic deprivation doesn't spark revolution alone. It's the poisoning of trust in institutions, in leaders, in the very fabric that binds society. When the middle class, the lifeblood of stability, fractures or disappears into extremism, the social contract tears irreparably. And then came Cuba in 1959, another iteration of this cycle, framed by the Cold War's global tensions and post-colonial unrest. Cuba was a nation of contradictions. Land of tropical abundance overshadowed by deep poverty and stark inequality. Its economy was largely dependent on sugar and offshore investments, controlled by the U.S. elite and local oligarchs. The gap between rich and poor was as glaring as in France or Russia. The Batista dictatorship, backed by corrupt elites and foreign interests, ruled with repression and favored extravagant lifestyles for the few. Inequality and corruption bred resentment, just as they had before. By the late 1950s, middle-class professionals and students joined peasants and workers in opposing the regime. The revolutionary promise of social justice and equality brought passionate hope. The middle class, disillusioned yet radicalized, found new purpose and alignment with Fidel Castro's guerrilla forces. When Batista fled, Cuba descended rapidly into the fourth stage: loss of faith in old institutions. The Catholic Church's influence waned, the corrupt judiciary was dismantled, the U.S.-backed political structure collapsed. Radical reforms swept through the economy, redistributing land and wealth, but also erecting a new one-party regime. As the Cold War intensified, Cuba became a proxy battlefield for global powers, its revolution morphing into authoritarianism wrapped in communist ideology. Here, the mass radicalization and chaos mirrored the prior stages seen in France and Russia, but on a smaller scale, yet with global consequences that rippled through hemispheres for decades. Cuba's revolution, too, swallowed dissenters and fractures within itself, transforming liberation into a new form of control. This emerging and repeating six-stage pattern, wealth disparity, corruption, middle-class fracturing, collapse of institutions, mass mobilization, and chaotic overthrow, remains one of the darkest legacies etched into human governance. It mocks the optimism of reform, the promises of progress, and the belief that history's forward march is linear or just. Modern America in 2025 is no longer merely watching history but living its reflection. The unequal concentration of wealth grows, government gridlocks symbolize paralysis and corruption, and the middle class strains under new pressures. Distrust in institutions surges as polarization deepens. Social movements swell, challenging the foundations of long-standing order. We must ask, are we already hurtling toward the final stages? If so, what does the future hold? Brutal upheaval or a darker form of authoritarian recalibration? The haunting question remains. Can a democracy, weighed down by its contradictions and blind to historical echoes, break free from a revolution cycle scripted centuries ago? Or are we condemned to repeat the past's greatest tragedies once again? As the echoes of guillotine blades fell silent in the streets of Paris, the world turned, not in respite, but with wary anticipation. Because the same pattern, the relentless cycle of revolution, had not dissipated. It lay dormant, waiting to ignite anew in disparate lands, under different flags, yet striking with the same relentless rhythm. Nowhere was this more hauntingly evident than in Russia, nearly 130 years later, where the forces unleashed by poverty, inequality, and institutional decay escalated into something far bloodier and more devastating. In 1917, Russia found itself in the crucible of the same six-stage revolt. An agrarian society stumbling grotesquely into the industrial age, stretched thin by the devastating pressures of World War I, was trapped in a boiling cauldron of rage and despair. The Tsarist regime was a relic, rigid and autocratic, presiding over a population where the extremes of wealth and deprivation could not have been more conspicuous. The aristocracy lived in opulent palaces, insulated by privilege and the richly padded walls of the Winter Palace, while millions, peasants, factory workers, and soldiers, starved, mutinied, and watched their world disintegrate. The first stage, stark inequality, was glaring. Despite Russia's vast natural wealth and fertile lands, the vast majority of peasants languished in crushing poverty. The land was held by a tiny nobility with titles more ancient than France's monarchy had been in 1789, yet their grip was slipping under the weight of modernization and war. Just as in France the second phase emerged, government paralysis and corruption. Tsar Nicholas II, much like Louis XVI, was indecisive and increasingly detached. His government struggled under the pressures of total war, failing to deliver food to cities or adequate weapons to troops. Corruption seeped through the bureaucracy like a poison, with court intrigues and incompetence widespread. The tragic irony was that middle-class professionals, intelligentsia and reformers, the burgeoning middle strata, sought moderate change, only to find their hopes dashed. The third stage unfolded in the Petrograd Soviets and the fractured Duma, as the middle class, radicalized and disillusioned, threw their support behind revolutionary factions. Their calls for constitutionalism and reform became drowned in a tidal wave of radicalism, ushering in Lenin and the Bolsheviks. By the time the winter snows fell in late 1917, faith in the old institutions had shattered completely. The Tsar abdicated, institutions dissolved, the Orthodox Church's power waned. This loss of faith, stage 4, allowed Lenin's promises of peace, land, and bread to captivate the population, even as the machinery of revolution turned toward tyranny. The fifth stage followed swiftly, as the revolutionary movement seized control of the masses. The murder of the Romanov family in 1918 was a grim echo of Louis XVI's execution, an irrevocable consecration of violent change. But unlike France's decade of terror, Russia descended into a protracted civil war, slaughtering millions, turning brother against brother. Stage 6, the collapse into chaos, never really ended in Russia's case, but evolved into a new form of despotism. Stalin's regime emerged from the chaos, a brutal dictatorship cloaked in revolutionary rhetoric, with purges and forced famines that dwarfed the French terror in scale and horror. Yet the Russian example deepens our understanding of the cycle. It reveals that revolution is not merely sudden rupture but a drawn-out convulsion, where the nightmare of order dissolving into chaos sometimes feeds new, even darker forms of order. It is the paradox of revolution, the promise of liberation birthing fresh chains. From Moscow, we trace the pattern forward to Cuba, 1959, where another cleavage between the old regime and a restless society tore the island apart. Again, vast inequality, government decay, and the middle class's radicalization fueled an insurgency that toppled a U.S.-backed dictatorship. Fidel Castro's revolution promised social justice, national sovereignty, and equality, yet soon gave way to suppression, economic hardship, and dependency, another cycle repeating beneath the tropical sun. These revolutions, scattered by century and geography, are not isolated storms but waves rising from the same undercurrent. Human societies under pressure from their own contradictions and inequalities. They expose the cyclical nature of justice and violence, hope and despair. Today, the United States stands at an unmistakable crossroads, a nation where inequality has reached new extremes. Government is increasingly perceived as corrupt or incapacitated. The middle class fragments, and long-standing institutions lose credibility. The rhythms of 1789, 1917, and 1959 beat faintly but unmistakably, signaling the approach of a critical stage, the loss of faith. What distinguishes America's crisis is its global reach and economic entanglement. The world's deepest financial networks entangled with calls for reform, protests, and political polarization. Yet beneath the surface lies the same skeletal sequence, a schism between elites and masses, middle-class radicalization, institutional breakdown. The haunting question is not if the script will continue, but who will control it. Will the forthcoming chaos spawn new democracies, or spiral into more insidious authoritarianisms? As history's dark choreography rehearses for its next act, the stakes have never been higher. And so, as the dusk deepens on established power, the revolutionary cycle waits poised to unfold once more, fated to test not just a nation, but the very assumptions of modern civilization. The echoes of 1789 did not fade with the guillotine's fall. They resonated across oceans and centuries, shaping the very fabric of revolutionary movements that followed. Fast forward to 1917 Russia, a vast, autocratic empire on the brink of collapse, struggling under the strain of war, famine, and social unrest. The parallels with France were unmistakable, almost eerie. Here, too, the initial cracks appeared in the form of stark economic inequality exacerbated by a brutal world war. The czars, entrenched in centuries of unchecked authority, presided over a rigid social hierarchy that mirrored France's estates. The nobility and clergy held immense wealth and privilege, while the peasantry, comprising nearly 80% of the population, toiled in poverty and starvation. Yet Russia's first stage unfolded under the dark shadow of industrialization, a new catalyst for destabilization. Unlike France, where the ancient regime was firmly rooted in a feudal order, Russia's rapid industrial growth created a volatile middle class and an embittered urban proletariat. These workers faced grueling conditions in factories that were often death traps, earning paltry wages while cities swelled with displaced peasants fleeing famine and land shortages. A new inequality emerged, not just of wealth, but of opportunity and dignity. This economic convulsion intensified distrust in the czarist government, which was not merely indifferent but brutally repressive. The second phase, government paralysis, was tragically stark in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, much like Louis XVI, was indecisive and removed from the people's suffering. He clung to outdated autocratic principles, even as the empire staggered into the catastrophe of World War I. The war effort drained resources, devastated the economy, and led to massive military defeats. Calls for reform were met with violent suppression. The Duma, Russia's fledgling parliament, was powerless. Factions within the government bickered endlessly, and corruption festered unchecked. Scandals involving the Tsarina and the mystic Rasputin only eroded legitimacy further. As food shortages became endemic and morale crumbled in the trenches, the radicalization of Russia's middle and working classes intensified. Unlike the bourgeois-led National Assembly of France, the Russian middle class, petty bourgeoisie and intelligentsia, found themselves caught between czarist ruthlessness and the rising appeal of the Soviets. Councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants advocating radical change. This was a critical divergence from France's trajectory, emphasizing how the middle class's role can shift from orders defenders to insurgent catalysts, driven by the epoch's unique social pressures. When the institutions failed, collapsing under the weight of war and revolt, faith in the Tsarist regime evaporated overnight. Stage 4 played out in the winter of 1917, with revolutionary fervor sweeping Petrograd and Moscow. The provisional government, born out of the February Revolution, symbolized the death knell of imperial authority, but was weak and indecisive, caught between continuing a devastating war and meeting popular demands for peace and land reform. This vacuum beckoned the Bolsheviks, who ruthlessly seized Stage 5, capturing the masses by promising peace, land, and bread. The October Revolution that year plunged Russia into chaos, civil war, and terror. Like Robespierre's radical purges, Lenin's Red Terror targeted enemies of the revolution, real and imagined, with mass arrests, executions, and suppression of dissent. The ecstatic promise of dictatorship of the proletariat devolved into the brutal consolidation of power under a new one-party state. Here lies a haunting philosophical pattern. Revolutions are not just political revolts. They are deep ruptures in a nation's soul, where old certainties die violently and new myths rise amid the carnage. They expose the fragility of human institutions and the ease with which hope can be consumed by fear and hatred. The promise of liberation curdles into oppression, as cycles of violence beget new autocracies masquerading as champions of the people. This six-stage cycle, economic inequality, government failure, middle-class fracture, institutional collapse, mass radicalization, and chaotic overthrow, is more than historical recurrence. It is a sobering lens through which to view the present. Cuba's 1959 revolution, often cast as a Cold War footnote, follows the identical rhythm, fueled by economic desperation, Batista's diktats, a frustrated middle class, and the radical appeal of Castro's insurgency. And now, as the United States confronts unprecedented levels of wealth disparity, entrenched political dysfunction, an alienated middle class, institutional distrust, and swelling movements on both extremes, the six-stage cycle looms once more. Are we witnessing history's relentless choreography, steps rehearsed in the blood of previous revolutions? Or can this modern superpower break the cycle, to rewrite the narrative and prevent descent into chaos? The answer remains suspended, a question hanging beneath the surface of our fractured society. But as the clock ticks toward greater instability, the lessons of France, Russia, and Cuba warn us. Revolution is not a distant spectacle. It is a living, breathing threat, with its own dark symphony already in motion.